Welcome to the East Cemetery, and we're just going to take a little walk over here, and I'll walk and talk at the same time. Before its incorporation as a town in 1866, Hudson was a neighborhood and an unincorporated village of Marlborough, Massachusetts, known as Feltonville. In 1868, a part of Bolton also became incorporated with the town of Hudson. The Main Street Cemetery closed, so all the plots were purchased in 1940. Which is this cemetery. So that's when they said no more people will be buried here. We're done. This one's all full. Only 3 burials have taken place since then, and the last burial was performed in 2023. It was a cremation of Arthur Franke. Arthur Franke was a great-grandson to one of the Brighams, who we're going to talk about today. But first, we're going to talk about Benjamin Priest. Benjamin's father, John Priest of Harvard, purchased 123 acres for exchange of Priest land and buildings in Harvard. Oh dear. Plus 700 pounds of cash, in cash. On March, I think it probably means 700 pounds of cash, yes? It says he purchased that much for $700, basically. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. On March 31st, 1738, this gentleman, Benjamin Priest, sold 1 acre of Priest land to Marlborough for $15 in order to build a cemetery, which is now this cemetery. He married Phoebe Bruce Priest in 1786, and they had 3 children. We're moving on to the next plot now.
We don't have to move very far.
We don't have to move because it's right here.
Right here.
Tiffany knows where things are. I'm just the voice. The early Coolidge family, so these are the Coolidge family members. You'll see David Coolidge right here, died in 1879. So early Coolidge family members here in Main Street Cemetery include Silas, who had 4 wives and 20 children. He was born in 1766. Not 4 wives at the same time, 1 at a time. He purchased substantial land on what is known as Central Street and divided it up among his sons. It became known as Coolidgeville. Among his descendants are David, who's buried here, and David's son Albert. And Albert had a son, Willie, who was born in Hudson, who was a major contributor to the society, but sadly he's not buried here. But you are in luck, because we are going to tell you about him anyways. William David Coolidge was a physicist and revolutionized radiology with X-ray tube called the Coolidge tube. He lived to be 101. And we still use that technology today. So this is his dad. Coolidge was enrolled in Hudson's one-room schoolhouse and then in Hudson High School. He won a state scholarship to MIT and went on to work for General Electric for the entirety of his career. In honor of him, the William D. Coolidge chapter of the National Honor Society at Hudson High School is named. Other descendants include former President Calvin Coolidge, who was a great-great-grandson of John Coolidge, and Hannah Priest of Marlborough. Isn't that interesting? I did not know that. Here you will see 2 Phoebes. This is really a kind of interesting fact that I didn't know until we started researching this, but these 2 are children of the Coolidges who died as young children, probably about 2 years apart. They probably died from a childhood, some kind of common childhood disease. From 1800 to 1870, the most common diseases at that time that children died from were tuberculosis, dysentery, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, or diphtheria. And the thing that's interesting is that it was common practice to name the second child of the same gender after its sibling who had passed away, which is just crazy if you can imagine you lose a child and then the next child you're like, we'll just name this one John too. That seems sad to me, but I suppose it was just a fact of life. So that is probably what happened with Phoebe and Phoebe. Thank you guys for coming over here to see Captain Francis Brigham. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. This is his marker. He was the great-great-grandson of John Brigham, who was born on April 12, 1813. He was the first of his family to come to the U.S. He married Sophia Gleason on January 5th, 1835. I am out of breath because I walked uphill. He was the son of Ivory and Sally Walker Brigham, whose names are on this stone as well. He was the first manufacturer of pegged shoes in the United States. He learned the trade from Lorenzo Stratton. He was one of the industrial giants that transformed Hudson into a leader in the boot and shoe industry. Francis's plant, built on the Assabet River in the late 1860s, was manufacturing showcase of its era. It burned down in the 1880s. He built and lived in the building that is now the Hudson Senior Center, which you guys just came here from, in the 1850s. He eventually built a estate on top of Washington Street, which became known as Nobility Hill, as there were many large homes of prominent businessmen on that part of the street. He served in the military, was the first president of the Hudson Savings Bank, and served as a Hudson selectman and then state representative. In 1865, he was one of the committee to establish boundary lines for the new town of Hudson. He was appointed to the new committee that would begin the work of incorporation. He had 6 children: Rufus, Wilbur, William, Waldo, Laura, and Ida. Waldo's not buried here, so you can ask where he is, but it's not here. Thanks. His grandson, Brigadier General William H. Brigham, though not buried in the cemetery, lived with his wife in the homestead until his death in 1911. He was also responsible for having the armory built in Hudson in 1910 by advocating with various government agencies and used his connection to win approval and funding for the project, which obviously we're really grateful for today. The next place that we're going is to check out the Bruce plot, which is right over here, so you guys can kind of move carefully. So if you've been paying attention as we've been walking through, you might notice that the stones, the headstones, and the monuments change over time, that different periods of time reflect different styles of art. These changes include what the stones are made out of too, what is engraved on them, and how they're placed. In the 19th century, marble was very popular, but so was sandstone and granite. Obviously, sandstone is not the strongest, toughest stone, so it tends to sort of break down a little easier. Behind us, you can see graves that are carved with a willow tree and an urn. The willow tree, which now that I've showed you, you will not be able to unsee it. You will see them everywhere. The willow tree represents mourning, like the weeping willow, and sorrow and loss. And the urn stands for death of the flesh. You will also see some stones that are just with a willow tree and no urn as we walk through the cemetery. So it's just sort of like whatever the family wanted to represent their loved one. So that stone that we were just looking at, and as we walk by, you guys can get a little closer to it if you want, but that's the Hapgood family. The Hapgoods were in Hudson by the end of the 17th century. In June of 1743, Samuel Witt, John Hapgood, and others living in an old Indian plantation petitioned the general courts that their land be set off as a distinct parish town, claiming that it is vastly fatiguing to attend the meeting. Their request was declined at that time, which is funny because I literally just said to someone at work, why is this not a Zoom call? Why do we have to be here for this? Can't we just all meet on Zoom? They probably felt the same way. They felt like it was too far to travel. Hold on, sorry. In terms of inscriptions, I skipped a page. My fault. In terms of inscriptions, epitaphs in the 19th century tombstones often conveyed the religious beliefs and values of the deceased and their families. Many epitaphs emphasized the idea of an afterlife or eternal rest, highlighting the significance of preparing for and embracing death as a transition to a better existence. Deacon Jonathan Hapgood, the son of John Hapgood, lays here with his wife. So this big stone is his stone, and the inscription on the bottom there that our friend was kneeling down to look at says, "Weep not for them, their bodies rest beneath the valley and sod. By mortal pain no more oppressed, their souls are with their God." Isn't that lovely? I thought that was really lovely. Here we are at the grave of the Wilkins family. This is Edward Wilkins, who was born in Marlborough and is buried here. His wife, Sarah, sorry, this is buzzing. It's better now. I don't know. Sorry if it's buzzing. His wife, Sarah Wilkins, is one of the first in the family to be buried at Main Street Cemetery. She was buried here in 1829, having died at 72 years of age. Their son, Edward, who is buried here, was the first man to die in the newly founded town of Hudson on March 21st, 1866. Gather round. This is Benjamin Prentice's grave. Benjamin Prentice was a former slave who lived in Connecticut. He was born in New London, Connecticut in 1760. In 1792, he sought emancipation and got as far away as Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, where he was sent back to Connecticut and sold for $300. Soon he made a second attempt for his liberty and succeeded. He went to Stowe, Massachusetts, where he lived for a few years. Then he went to Marlborough, where he resided for over 60 years. He married Candace Hapgood on April 23rd, 1800. And then after she died, a second wife named Hannah, who he survived by about 30 years. He had no children, but spent his last days with the children of his second wife. He was of short stature and venerable appearance. I think that means he was handsome. On April 10th, he bought a home near the Rice Farm on Washington Street, which was once owned by Hannah Goodale. And he sold the house to the town of Marlborough as a poorhouse. Marlborough later sold the house to Benjamin Prentice. At the time of his death, he was the oldest man in town, being 97 years old, 1 month and 16 days. Though he had never received a formal education, he was intelligent and respected. For many years, he exercised his right of suffrage, the question of his citizenship having never been raised. So this is Benjamin Prentice. So this stone over here belongs to Abigail Hayward, or at least we think that's her last name. Her last name is illegible, but going off the grave plot records and the nearby graves, that's what we think her name was. You can also see the carving of a handshake. Symbolic hand gestures were often carved into tombstones. Handshake or clasped hands such as these symbolized farewell or reunion in the afterlife. Another common carving was a hand pointed up, which you can see on other graves in the cemetery, and it usually indicated the way, like, salvation is up. And then Tiffany said to me yesterday, there's also ones with the hand pointing down. That doesn't mean the person is being sent somewhere else. It just means that God is helping lift them up out of their grave.
So it's actually like their fingers pointing. So it's like their hand with their finger pointing or the finger pointing down, but it's not.
They're not saying you're going to somewhere else other than heaven.
Yeah, so walking through the cemetery here, I did not see it. Not that I did not see every single grave, but I spent a lot of time here recently. I didn't see any with the hands pointing down, but there are some with the hands with the fingers pointing up. So if you happen to want to do some exploration on your own, I'm sure you will see that. I did find a few throughout the cemetery.
This is where Charles Brigham, who was a cousin of Francis and known to many as Uncle Charles Brigham. He was anti-slavery, a prohibitionist, and a vegetarian. My favorite part is that he was a vegetarian. He was the leader of the Union Society that built the Unitarian Church in 1861, and he became a principal engineer of the Fugitive Slave Underground Railway. Don't love his prohibitionist leanings, but do love that part of his life. He harbored many emancipated humans like Frederick Douglass. And his great-granddaughter, Marjorie Brigham Barber, said, as long as I can remember, I heard about my great-grandfather, Charles Brigham, and the secret passageway in his home on Washington Street, where he hid people who were on their way to Canada. So this grave over here is Daniel Stratton III. At 4 years old, his family moved to a farm just across the line in Bolton. The territory eventually became part of Hudson during the annexation of Hudson in 1868. Daniel Stratton was a leading petitioner for the Bolton territory and was selected to represent Bolton on the Committee of Five to prosecute the movement for an incorporation to Hudson. The undertaking was consummated and the Stratton homestead was included in the new town of Hudson. He married Tryphena Rice Holman of Sterling on December 31st, 1839 at the age of 22, and the union continued for 50 years and 1 day. They had their golden wedding anniversary with numerous friends on December 31st, 1889, and on the next day, following soon after his retirement for the night, without hardly a premonition, the messenger of death summoned the head of the happy and prosperous household to a better land. So he died the day after his 50th wedding anniversary celebration. Daniel Stratton inherited the farm from his father, Daniel II, and built one of the first silos in the country. He helped establish the Hudson United Methodist Church, and he became a trustee of the Hudson Savings Bank in 1869. After his death in 1890, his son Herbert assumed the farming duties for the next 50 years. Their son, Daniel Wilbur Stratton, the brother of Herbert, became a civil engineer, conducted an insurance and title conveyance business. He was the treasurer of the Hudson Savings Bank, water commissioner, and town moderator. He lived at the corner of Broad and Summer Street until 1909. A brother, George Stratton, died of measles at age 4 and was one of the first people buried in this cemetery just 1 year after its creation. Lorenzo, who was an uncle, married Mary Park Stratton and had 3 sons. He went into business for himself, and he was the first to use a treadmill power in the shoe plant in Hudson. Prior to that, the power came from a water mill. He lived on Lincoln Street with his wife Mary. He died in 1918. Rufus Stratton, who is buried elsewhere in this cemetery, was his son, and he was a cunning businessman. Prior to the this is the best story. This is Tiffany's truly shining star. Prior to the turn of the century, hens seldom laid eggs in the winter, and when they did, the eggs would often bring $1.20 a dozen. That's a lot, just so you know. Not now it is, but back then it was. Rufus learned that when he was going for his noonday meal, Solon Wood, who operated the store in the center of what is now Wood Square, right downtown, would case the merchandise and prices in his windows. Stratton, who customarily left earlier for his noon meal, was aware of Wood's habit and so acted accordingly. Before locking up to go home for lunch, he would put a substantially lower price on the eggs in the window. Wood, knowing how hard eggs were to come by at any price, couldn't fathom how Stratton was offering them at such a low price. Nevertheless, with his prestige at stake, when he returned, he would mark his eggs down to the price that he noticed on Stratton's window. In the meantime, when Stratton would come back, he would change the price to his eggs until he was sure Wood was back. Wait until he was sure Wood was back at his shop and had reduced his price. Then he would send someone to buy Wood's eggs, the same time boasting his reputation for the hard-to-get commodity. Isn't that awesome and hilarious? Charles Sherwood Stratton, who was also known as General Tom Thumb, was an American with dwarfism who achieved great fame as a performer under circus pioneer P.T. Barnum. He was a relative of the Hudson Strattons and was known to attend family functions. Now we are back at the Goodnow family's plot. Silas Goodnow, who was married first to Hannah, then married Sally, died at the age of 27. George Goodnow, age 4, and his mother, Sally Goodnow, age 27, were buried here on May 1st, 1826. He was the first person buried in Main Street Cemetery after its inception. Silas had 4 other children, 2 of which he lost in their teens. His son, Rufus, lived to be 20, and their daughter, Nancy, lived to be 87. It's a lot of details about their ages when they died, but that's all I have about these guys. So we're going to keep moving. If you guys will direct your attention to this marker, this is the Houghton family. George Houghton, born Earl H. Southwick in 1922 in Canada, changed his name in 1844. He was the oldest child of Elisha and Lydia Southwick. Elisha Southwick, whose name is on the front here, was a descendant of Lawrence Southwick, whose name appears in the records of Salem as early as 1639. Lawrence and his wife Cassandra of Salem were Quakers and suffered much persecution in the form of fines and imprisonment for being Quaker. Earl's parents endured many trials, and it appeared that his father's mind was verging on insanity. So the family moved to Bolton, where his father was placed in an asylum and died at the age of 35. So sad. Earl was 8 years old when this happened, and the family was left in poverty. His mother, Lydia, was a woman of spirit and courage. She found a home for Earl and his 2 siblings, where Earl had to work long days on a farm, milking cows early in the morning till late at night. He was not served meals, but was allowed to eat leftovers after the family ate their meals. When still a youth, he was advised to take his mother's surname, and as his father's Quakerism was considered odious. Thus, Earl became George Houghton. He later became an apprentice to Captain Frank Brigham, learning the trade of making shoes. He lived in the Brigham home, and while he worked hard, he did have enough to eat. After some time with Captain Brigham, he decided to start his own business. He quit his job with a coworker, Mr. Tarbell. They worked long days and made shoes at night. George Houghton and Captain Brigham remained rivals after their separation, but both were successful. In 1865, both worked together along with early citizens to establish the new town of Hudson. Eventually, Earl became the owner and possessor of the largest manufacturer in Hudson, with a capacity of anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 pairs of shoes per day. He was widely known as Boss Houghton. He was not content with this, so he finally owned and equipped the finest tannery and currying establishment in the state. Willing and determined to help the growing industries of the town, he virtually engineered the erection of a pianoforte manufactory, to which he put $16,000 of his own capital. This later burned, and George lost quite a bit of money. But it wasn't a total loss, since he had established his own private fire company. He also supported others in starting their own businesses, including a machine shop with the Tower brothers as its first successful owners. Due to changing economic conditions and wanting to keep his workers employed, he had to declare bankruptcy in 1875. He was so well known and respected that when the Japanese embassy visited America to inspect the shoe industry, they were brought to his manufactory to see the wonders of improvement in manufacture of leather shoes. Mr. Houghton was married twice. Both of his wives were, in the fullest sense, helpful to him and shared in his struggles and successes. He had a total of 8 children, though only one lived to adulthood. He lived in the three-peaked house at Main and High Street, but his home was raised in 1958 to build Hudson Catholic High School, where Walgreens is now located. He built a school in town, provided early Methodists with funds to build a church on Main Street, and provided St. Michael's parishioners space to hold services. You may have noticed that there are lots of little stones scattered through the cemeteries with no markers on them. These are the footstones of the graves. The tradition has its roots in Christian custom, where the deceased was buried with their head to the west and their feet to the east to allow them to face the rising sun and Jesus upon resurrection. I always wondered what the little stone markers were. But like you can see one here.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
There's a lot of them, actually. So we have 2 more spots for you on the tour tonight. The first one is the Witt family. Ebenezer and Adeline had a daughter named Frances Emma Witt. This is another really good story. Frances Emma Witt, who was not buried here. Frances tells the story of their neighbors, the Houghtons, and their horticultural interests, as they had always had the newest variety of plants. Mrs. Houghton came over one day with a small green sprig for Mrs. Witt, Frances's mother. She said, "It's a new plant called a love apple. It has a little round red fruit. They say some people eat them. But you just pinch one of those leaves and smell it. Can you imagine anyone eating a fruit that grows on such a stinky plant as that?" And this is the record of the first tomato plant in Hudson. Isn't that so funny? I mean, I love the way tomato plants smell, but that's because I like to eat tomatoes, so. I suppose you might think that I was disgusting if you smelled it. If you look right behind you, we are at the oldest grave site in this cemetery. It's a site of Mother and Baby Rice, who were buried in 1814. At this time, the town of Hudson was called New City and wasn't yet a cemetery. No additional information is found on these 2 individuals. Hudson death records only go back to 1866, when the town was incorporated, and Marlborough had a large fire, as some of you already know, in the early 1900s that burned all their records. So these stones, there's no stone, but we know from studying the plots that this is where they were buried. Right where the little white flag is. The last name of the family was Rice, and it was a mother and her baby.
I do hope that everyone enjoyed the tour.
It was great.
Got some new information, some fun information. And again, we really want to say thank you to Anna for reading tonight, and to the Historical Society for collaborating, putting the information together for us.
And to all of you guys for showing interest. Yeah.
It was absolutely.
It was great. Thank you so much.